box. People with questions, please send it in the chat box. And after the presentations, we'll have a question and answer session, including responses from our three speakers. And we expect to wind up by about 8 p.m. India time. So let me just begin by introducing the topic. Now, this is not a pure trade and trade regime discussion. It's more an interaction between the emerging geopolitics and the new trade and investment regimes. Because in this moment, of post-COVID recovery on a process in India and in the world, we are at the same time. This is a post-Ukraine, post-Galwan world. Let me sum it up like that, where there is unprecedented polarization between the West, especially the US and Russia, and between the West, especially the US and China. And we are seeing India is at a critical moment when several major trade agreements are under negotiation.
Is it stuck? Is it stuck for me or for everyone?
I think it's true for everybody.
Okay, just a minute.
We can't hear Sri.
Yeah, just a minute.
Yeah. Okay.
Is the net gone?
Yeah, I think I'm reconnected now. So I'm sorry. I'll just repeat that sentence.
Can you check if people
Can you hear me? Can people hear me? Okay, great. So just wanted to say that geopolitics was always part of trade during the Cold War, despite successive rounds of trade liberalization multilaterally under the GATT, and there was a Cold War polarization, and there were all kinds of regimes of technology export controls. Like COCOM, like under the nuclear regime, the NPT, later the mid-80s, the MTCR, the cell technology control regime, and so forth. But in the first post-Cold War decade, after 1991, there seems to be a period of genuine multilateralism, with the WTO coming into effect from 1995, and de-escalation of tensions post-Cold War. Now, that seemed to have changed again. At the same time, from about the 90s onwards, and especially from the early 2000s, although there have been a trend towards free trade agreements, sometimes called FTAs, sometimes called PTAs, which can be bilateral or which can be regional or multilateral, they can be, and so on. A variety of types of FTAs have proliferated in the last 2 decades. And India was active in the first decade of this century in negotiating FTAs. And for about 10 years, since about 2011-12, there's been a halt to that. But right now, India is in the middle of negotiating several crucial trade agreements, which I'll leave to our speakers. Don't want to preempt them. And at the same time, this is happening at a time when there is an unprecedented geopolitical polarization between the West and Russia and the West and China. And so how is this interaction between geopolitics and trade to play out? In the international relations theory, the debate between neo-realists who emphasize hard power and the neoliberals who emphasize that growing interdependence, including complex interdependence at the product level, for example, Apple iPhones, is going to limit the usability of or even leverageability of military power. And some of this, the debate goes both ways. One is that neoliberalists say that look at Ukraine, it's a classic old-style war with land invasion and so on. And others say that look, interdependence is going to moderate all this. And Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, just recently stepped back from decoupling from China to de-risking. So interdependence creates its own moderation of geopolitical polarization. But I'll leave it to that. I don't want to go on more. So the key thing today in the trade agreements that India is trying to negotiate, it is in a context of unprecedented geopolitical polarization. So in this context, how do geopolitics and trade interact? And we look forward to hearing from our three speakers on this. And so without further ado, I'll hand the floor to Professor. I'll first, sorry, I will introduce the three speakers. Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, our first speaker, is currently Director General at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, a New Delhi-based think tank. He works on issues related to development economics involving development finance, SDGs, and South-South cooperation, apart from trade, investment, and innovation linkages, with special focus on WTO. He's currently also Vice Chairman, Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Good Governance and Policy Analysis, and ex officio Vice Chairman of the Madhya Pradesh State Policy and Planning Commission. He's also member Board of Governors, Reserve Bank of India. Our second speaker, Professor Amita Batra, is Professor of Economics and former Chairperson, Center for South Asian Studies, School of International Studies at JNU. She's a member of the advisory group for G20 Finance Track Agenda, Ministry of Finance, January 22 to December 23. She's also a member of the B20 India Task Force for Inclusive GVCs and Resilient Global Trade and Investment, 2023. Her most recent book is titled India's Trade Policy in the 21st Century, 2022, published by Routledge, London. And our third speaker, Dr. Amitendu Palit, is Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead Head in Economics at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. He is an economist specializing in international trade and investment policies, FTAs, supply chains, connectivity, cross-border data flows, and the Indian economy. He sits on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Trade and Investment. He is Senior Research Fellow Honorary at the Wong Center for Study of MNCs and advisor for Athena Infonomics. Let me hand the floor to Professor Sachin Chaturvedi for his presentation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Sridharan, for this opportunity. It's a great pleasure to join you at this University of Pennsylvania Institute for the Advanced Study. It's a great pleasure for me to join you. Thanks for the invitation. It's a matter of great delight that I'm joined in by none other than Professor Amita Batra, who has been one of the leading commentators on trade and geopolitics, and her interest in finance and linkage of that with trade is something which has always impressed me a lot. So I'm delighted to be part of a panel where she's there along with my very dear friend Amitendu Palit. So I think they would be doing the heavy lifting that is done. But let me also, Shri, congratulate you for this brief note that you have circulated. And I think this note has been written with the full 360-degree view of how things are unfolding and in what way we are trying to see the larger picture unfolding. So the broad contours are very well captured. I think when we talk about trade and the way we look at the new sort of order which is emerging and how geopolitics is going to influence trade and investment, I think it's also very important for us to realize that, and it is probably not enough today to bring in issues which are also related to the trade and sustainable development goals, because I'm keeping that out of the geopolitics. But as we see, EU and others are leveraging the environmental concerns which are there as part of the cross-border trade, and then influencing a sort of debate that we had almost a decade ago, or even more than that, as part of the non-tariff barriers. But they are becoming a reality. They are very much there on the table. I'm not bringing that in. There is also a huge degrowth debate which is coming in from climate change perspective. All that is there, but I'm keeping that out for our conversation, more in terms of bringing focus on how geopolitics is changing the architecture that we are ending up with. But at this point, certainly, I think it is important to remind ourselves the debate and discussions which are emerging in the G20, but also in the BRICS. And I think it is pertinent on our part to see where the global dynamics is going. And I think at the G7 summit recently, the discussion that we had on trade, the discussion that we had in the rounds of discussions which were there at G20, a couple of points are emerging very well. And I think some statistics is worth getting reminded of. And I think the fact that G7 in 1961 had almost a share of 68.5% on constant prices and around 70.5% in current prices in 1961 of the G7 in the global economy. And that has now come down to 44% on constant and 44.9% on current prices. So you see a huge fall in the global G7 share in the GDP. Same is the case with the labor force. If you look at their share in 1991 in the labor force, the total number of people in the G7 countries who were part of the labor force, 13.9 million, and that has now come down to 11 million. Population total, which is active, has come down from 17 million in 1961 to only $9 million. So on one hand, you're seeing the going down of their share in the global economy. You're also seeing the number of hands are also extremely limited. And this is also getting reflected in the gross capital formation that is happening for G7. They share in the total capital creation, which was 37%. It has now come down to 33%. The domestic savings share has also come down from 35% to 29%. Their share in exports has come down from 35.9% in 61, has come down to 29%. This is something which is even the foreign exchange reserve, the G7 share in 1991 was 44%, which has now come down to 19%. So this is something, Shri, which is important for us to understand, that the geopolitics of the global trade and investment would largely be determined by the countries which are also coming on the table. So the time when G7 used to call others as outreach countries is no more the case. We are seeing others coming on the table, and they are likely to perform better. And in this backdrop, if I do not spend too much time, but tell you and remind all of us the rising share of India, at least in the global economy, our consistent performance with high rate of economic growth, our widening base in the global trade, and our investments, they are absolutely important. And it is in this backdrop that you see the larger rise of the global south. And here people generally brush aside this, saying that it is largely China, but that's not the case. At RIS, we have calculated the share, taking China out and seeing how trade in high technology goods, trade in medium technology goods, and trade in low technology goods has come up. And the data is absolutely clear. If you see the trade in medium technology goods and high technology goods, even if you take out China, it has gone up from 7.8% to 22%. This is something which has gone up in the period 1991 to 2023. This is something which is extremely important for us to realize, that the technology base of the global south minus China has gone up. And this is important in the sense that the high growth in India, the high growth in the global south is telling us a story which is extremely important. And it is also hereby going to stay in terms of trade as an enabling factor for high economic growth. And this is something where in the G7 countries, you are already right from 1989 onwards, you are seeing deceleration in the growth of trade, and you are seeing that the GDP traction that was there with trade, it has gone down. At a global level, yes, but more so for the G7 countries and less so for the global south. So this, I think, perspective is important. India's new wave of FTAs is giving a sort of momentum that all the 21st century FTAs should have. And I think Amita has written extensively well on some of our new FTA stories. It is important for us to realize that the global south largely is going in that direction. And this is how the geopolitics would be influenced when we see the larger sort of acceptance. Even in case of India, whatever India rejected earlier in terms of Singapore issues or other dimensions, now you see India accepting it. The fact that Singapore issues, all four of them, the government procurement, the investment protection, the idea of accepting competition policy or labor law reforms, out of 10 commitments, 6 have been accepted by India. So this is something where India is now far more placed. And this is what is, once this acceptability is coming in, the growing focus of India in terms of linking up with the other actors, particularly with entering in a new set of agreement with the EU, opening up the dialogue with the UK and with IPEF, US-led Quad process. I think it is absolutely important. The geopolitics in terms of concentration and consolidation in the Asia Pacific region is expanding. And this is the new reality. If you look at all the 4 pillars, people very often point out that India has not agreed to be in the trade pillar. But if you see, and we are just releasing a new paper by me from RIS in terms of how all the 4 pillars are actually intertwined. They are contributing to the larger process, and India being out of the trade pillar doesn't mean much. It is not about tariffs. It is about trade facilitation. It is about transparency and accountability. It is about cross-border data flows, where our position has evolved. So CPTPP or RCEP, they are not very far. The unease that we saw earlier is something which is not going to be influenced. And the COVID crisis with the disruption in the supply chain, as your note very rightly points out, I think is a case in point. If you look at what China has done with the critical metals and elements, you find almost $125 billion investment by China from 2003 to 2017, and it has happened in 19 countries. If you see 19 cobalt producing mines in Congo are with China, the processing units. So the disruption that has happened in select critical metals is something in terms of the world losing out in terms of the value chain. So this disruption in supply chain that has happened is largely in terms of the Chinese companies that have brought in the larger control that is needed. And here, Sri, important point is how we are going to take that forward. If you look at the new MSP, the Mineral Security Partnership, which was announced in June 2022, which is a US-led coalition, is something which is going to take forward US, Australia, Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Sweden, Britain, and the EU. So this gives you the bandwidth in terms of how geopolitics is responding to some of these disruptions. And the co-opted countries would include Mozambique, Namibia, Tanzania, Zambia, Congo, and of course, Brazil. So this, you can now see what role Global South would play in terms of the issues that are going to be addressed and how they are going to be addressed. I see I'm running out of time now, but let me just make one point at the end and then close. And this is in terms of the 2 factors that are going to be playing an extremely important role. One, of course, is a cross-cutting theme of technology. Access to technology is going to play an extremely important role in further transforming the geopolitics and its development. As you might have seen, the Quad has given a call. The principal scientific advisors of the Quad, and the efforts that are on in IPF is to bring in technology that is going to play an important role. Similar is the importance of AFCFTA, Africa, and Africa's positioning in the whole process. It is not just about critical battles, but the geostrategic and geopolitical co-option for select African countries across for resuming supply chain, for the market access, I think is going to play an extremely important role. And from that perspective, Shri, I feel AFCFTA is going to contribute immensely. It's 1.3 billion people across 55 countries with GDP, which is valued around 3.4 trillion. Huge base for key minerals and metals, but also for raw materials that are important for our food security, renewable energy, and also the biodiversity base that is needed for oceans. So these are the four sort of dimensions where both Africa and technology are going to play an important role. Before I close, let me just also quickly mention here in terms of the regional agreements that are coming up. And I think the sub-regional arrangements here are important. As I was saying, RCEP and others in the Asian region are important, but more would be of the BIMSTEC, the BBIL. Some hassles have been there, but more are getting sorted out. And this is going to be the crux in terms of how the new geopolitics would emerge, where localization of trade in the local regions is going to get traction. More efforts by key entities across the globe, major transnational corporations are now trying to see how local sourcing for local market supply is possible, and how we reduce the carbon footprint. So all the multinational corporations are under pressure, and today there is not enough time, but there are at least 12 such transnational corporations we have documented at RIS, which have now tried to produce at levels where local sourcing is possible and local market is to be provided. And this is, I think, going to be an important trend in the days to come when we talk about reducing carbon footprint of the global trade, but at the same time trying to bring in the geopolitical dimension for protection of the value chains that are there. I would stop here, but we would take the questions forward, Shri. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. I'll pass the floor. Let me hand over the floor to Professor Amita Batra for her presentation. Thanks.
Can I just request Dr. Sridharan for Amithendu to make the first presentation first? I just have to attend to something here. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I'll be back in 5 minutes. I'll just be back in 5 minutes. If you can, please.
I would like to invite Dr. Amithendu Palit to make the second presentation. Is that okay with you?
I'm perfectly fine, Sri, no problem. So
please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I join Professor Sachin Chaturvedi in thanking you and the CASI for firstly convening a discussion on this extremely important subject, which I think is not just topical, but also a subject which has not been as adequately addressed as it should have been, because the connection between trade and investment in geopolitics has actually become exceedingly prominent over the last 4 to 5, 6 years. Particularly in the Indian context, and there should have been much more attention devoted to that. I'm very glad that you have taken the initiative to bring this up. Let me just bring back a little bit of history into the context. Shri, you alluded to the evolution in the global trading patterns, particularly the evolution of the global rules-based trade framework of the WTO. Now, I think those of us are familiar with the general characteristic of global trade and the policy evolution around the subject would not hesitate to reflect on the view that except for a period which marked the formation of the WTO and its subsequent functioning, and I would put a period of, let us say, 20 plus years to that, beginning from the middle of the decade of 1990s till about 2015. Except for this period, The entire period prior to that, which was the period of the Cold War, and thereafter, we have actually seen trade and geopolitics existing together. It was only this brief period of 20 years, which in a sense was the most symbolic and classic period of economic globalization, where the multilateral trade order functioned in a way where it was able to keep the politics at check, that we did actually see a certain degree of predominance being taken by trade rules over geopolitical impulses, or more precisely, the ability of multilateral trade rules to stay cushioned from political pressures that emerged around it. I think when we look specifically at the Indian context, India was perhaps for a very long time wanting to saddle two paths independent of each other. It wanted to stay posited in its ideological construct of a global geopolitical entity, which would also be realistic at the same time, but keep that separate from its interests in global trade, which predominantly featured around the success of the multilateral rules-based trade framework. And at the same time, there was also efforts to get engaged in regional agreements selectively. So that is where we see that the decade of the 2000s was a period where India signed several free trade agreements. Not that these agreements were very exhaustive in scope and character, but nonetheless, there were agreements which showed India's inclination to also enter into free trade agreements along with its participation in the global rules-based trade regime, perhaps partly driven by the frustration that India's very strong expectations, along with a lot of expectations of several developing countries from the Doha development agenda in the WTO, didn't materialize the way it should have been. But moving forward, by the time we came to the end of 2019 and the COVID-19 pandemic, which was kind of a black swan event, once in a generation event that took over the world, I think there were three important factors that became very evident. The first is the fact that before the COVID-19 itself, Indian foreign policy had started taking a different shape. And this foreign policy was reflective of India's efforts and desire to become a much more prominent voice in global matters and regional matters. And that reflected in a lot of strong articulation which India made on a large number of issues of global significance compared with what it used to do before. India also started reflecting on its role in very major regional configurations, like, for example, the ASEAN, the BIMSTEC, the BRICS, for example, where it was not just a question of India being a passive player anymore, but beginning to take a position which will be reflective of India's own understanding of the global context. But soon after, and just before COVID, there were certain developments, one of which was obviously India's withdrawal from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which created some ripples with respect to India's larger worldview of free trade and engagement in trade. And then thereafter, the COVID. And I think along with COVID, there were realizations that the global geopolitics is beginning to change in a very rapid fashion. And that rapid fashion, combined with the fact that India's outlook towards global engagement had already changed, positioning India for a much bigger role, at least in terms of ambition in global affairs, made India conscious about the fact that a proactive foreign engagement policy cannot be exclusive from a proactive foreign trade policy. In the sense, the two had to proceed hand in hand, because it is pretty much clear that the history of the world economy after the Second World War, and even today, when one looks clearly at the major global economies of the world, the economies which actually command geopolitical influence are those which command economic influence first. And thereafter, they command geopolitical influence, because in that sense, geopolitical influence is actually a function of the economic influence that countries have. Now, with that understanding, I think there started a phase of a revised outlook in India's trade engagement with the rest of the world. And along this change, there were also other significant developments that happened around the world, one of which was the fact that we saw the formation of a China plus one strategy that began taking shape across the world in a very significant fashion, because the understanding was already there that supply chains had become heavily concentrated, and they had become heavily concentrated because of economic reasons. But those economic reasons and the degree of concentration that was visible also made countries sit up and take notice of the fact that it is not just exogenous disturbances like the COVID-19 that might make the supply chains go completely awry. The fact that certain countries have the command over supply chains in an overwhelmingly monopolistic fashion might actually put them in a position to weaponize those advantages to their geopolitical advantage. So that understanding pushed them into a direction where diversification very important. And I think Sachin alluded to the process of the G20 conversation, the G7 conversation. Today, we have come a fairly long way from the time the China plus one strategy actually began, right after COVID in a very forceful fashion. And today we actually see there is a conciliation that is being attempted to be brought in between the avowed objective of decoupling vis-a-vis that of de-risking. So I think the challenge that the combination of a very complicated and fast evolving geopolitics is bringing before the world is the fact that much as there is a strong imperative to decouple from sources that enjoy monopoly over certain supplies, over supply chains, much as that is advisable and desirable, it might not always be backed by strong economic reasons. As a result of that, we have seen countries across the world, not just India, the United States giving very heavy and active subsidies for relocation of supply chains, the Chips and Science Act, the IRA Act. The European Union has gone into very extensive semiconductor acts. Korea has gone into that. Japan has gone into that. India has followed with the production-linked incentives, trying to build up local capacities in this regard. But the point over here is that whether there is decoupling or not, the fact that supply chains need to be brought back into a position where they comprise less of vulnerability is something which also drives home the fact that those supply chains need to be refashioned through a different character of trade engagement. And this is probably for the first time when India's free trade agreements have started actively looking at the prospect of more resilient supply chain classifications. And while the new set of trade agreements that India has got into or is negotiating, for example, the one with United Arab Emirates has been completed. The first phase of the free trade agreement with Australia has been completed. The ones with UK, Canada, and European Union are in the works. Now, all of these, without explicitly mentioning so, are beginning to take note of the fact that supply chains need to be calibrated in a manner which helps in enhancing their resilience. And that resilience is not just necessarily an economic efficiency logic. There is also a certain strong degree of geopolitics backing that concept. And at the same time, Sri, I think it is also perhaps important to take note of the fact that when one looks at a country like India today, and the fact that it is already the world's fifth largest economy, it's poised to become, given the understanding of this trajectory of India 20, 25, 30 years downward would clearly bring one to the situation that the kind of economic growth which India aspires for to actually push it itself into the position of a world leader is something which cannot be achieved without capturing greater shares of world markets. And for that, it is necessary to get engaged in foreign trade as actively as possible. But I think this is where there is an interesting caveat that I want to draw your attention to. There are countries of the world which have practiced very aggressive neoliberal trade engagement. But there are also countries of the world which have engaged in trade with their own national interests as the priorities. Now, between the two, the balance is often, very thin. I mean, for certain countries, external engagement is a higher priority than internal engagement because the scale effects of their economies, given their limited domestic size, is much less, and they need to integrate with the rest of the world much faster. Even a country like Australia is a typical example of that. Even a country like the United Kingdom is a typical example of that. India is different as much as is the United States, as much as is China, or even Indonesia, or maybe perhaps Brazil, because these countries not just only have big domestic economies with a very complicated political character of those domestic economies, but they also produce a very different set of challenges, which are not always comparable with those that others face, as a result of which we see the outlook towards external trade being fashioned with a large number of variables for countries like India, which at the same time have a bundle of contradictions that policymakers need to look into very carefully. So what India is, in a sense, aspiring to do, according to my understanding, through its new, I would say, robust and spirited engagement in free trade agreements, is actually trying to fashion a character of trade engagement which is consistent with its national interests. Now, those national interests imply access to markets, access to resources, facilities for movement of its people, and also the ability to play an important role in the shaping of global standards, which are extremely important because today India is beginning to take part in those issues with respect to trade negotiations, which at a point in time, maybe 10, 15, completely confident of engaging in. For example, the subject of digital economy. Or say, for example, the subject of not just intellectual property, but well advanced to the intellectual property systems into more nuanced versions. Or say, for example, the question of environmental standards. Now, when India is beginning to play a role in these matters, it is actually doing so with a very clear national interest at the back of its mind. And that national interest is not necessarily protectionism. I think this is a line which needs to be understood very clearly. Protectionism is actually a backward step. But looking at national interest and trying to maximize trade engagement with national interest at the back of the mind of the policy is a different thought altogether. And that's what major industrial economies of the world have always done. And I think India took that role with a very strong vigor to it. And that role is actually consistent with its vision of being a major global actor. It is exporting to the rest of the world through its very proactive engagement in a large number of global fora, including, for example, becoming the voice of the global South in the G20, or playing a very active role in aligning its interests and balancing those with those of the G7, or in the ASEAN, or in the BRICS, and many other places. So, Sri, I would end my intervention over there on the note that I think over the last 5 years, we have seen a marked change in the way India has been attempting to refashion its external trade policy. And very clearly, the evolving geopolitics has played an important role in influencing this new outlook. It's going to be challenging. It's not easy to balance, both the trajectories together, because both the trajectories, particularly the political trajectory, is something which is very wholly exogenous, and it's a product of factors which are in a way beyond India's control, much as it is beyond the control of most of the actors of the global world. But what I particularly feel heartened about is that the fact that India has taken note of this very important congruence between politics and trade is actually a very heartening character. So I will sort of end my intervention at this point in time and look forward to further discussions. Thank you for the opportunity again.
May I?
I'm sorry. Sorry, I was muted. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your presentation, and I'll pass the floor to Professor Amitabh Batra.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sridharan, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today among these having been preceded by two very profound expositions. I thank you for this opportunity again, and my apologies for having changed the order of the presentations. But I will, as I make my presentation, it's brief, but I'm going to divide it into three parts. The first part, I just want to give a chronological evolution of the interaction between politics and trade as we've seen it and as we see it emerge in the most aggressive format today. I really see the start of this, what we see today as a very apparent rivalry between the US and China, playing itself out in the field of technology as well as critical minerals, including what has become, in terms of energy security, climate change, as Sachin had mentioned earlier, But how I see it, the beginning or the early markings of this, in recent times is really at the turn of the first decade of the 2000s, 2009, 10, at the time of Obama presidency, when we really saw the utilization of the WTO format, but in a variant of that in terms of the emergence of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whereby the idea was really to bring, that pivot to Asia, as Obama had put it at that time, where the idea was really to bring China around to playing or involving itself in trade according to the rules of the game, The feeling had been that China had risen. By 2008, China was the leading trade partner of almost all economies of the world. It was a major trading economy in the world, and it had already positioned itself as the factory of the world, The feeling and the sentiment at that time that existed was that much of this had been achieved by China not really following the rules of the game, that is of the multilateral trade order, So this was trying to be achieved then by the emergence or the formulation of the Trans-Pacific Order by bringing in very high level WTO plus provisions, such as those that dealt with intellectual property, with state-owned enterprises, subsidies, etc. Much of this was done for that reason, This, of course, all changed, with the coming in of the Trump presidency. And as Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that lost its significance in terms of the multilateral rules being used to bring China around. It was really unilateralism and bilateralism that picked up pace as far as Trump, the US-China rivalry, as it was being played out after that, We had a series of, the frictions between these two economies playing itself out in terms of imposition of higher tariffs, both by United States and then by China, sequentially so over a period of time, trying to play out their rivalry in the trade field. In the process, what we saw was, of course, a violation of the multilateral rules. There was this bilateralism of imposition of tariff that violated the MFN principle as far as the multilateral system was concerned. So we already saw trade as an instrument of politics, or political rivalries as far as these two major economies of the world or trading economies of the world were concerned. After that, what we have seen, now is a real aggressive form of trade instruments being used as far as, the politics playing itself out, and particularly the rivalry between US and China is concerned, is in terms of protectionism being used or protectionist instruments being used by these two economies in order to project or in order to promote their own interest. More so as far as the United States is concerned, in the form of what we have seen as a very obvious return to the industrial policy combined with trade policy, reflected as it is in the IRA. Similarly, what we see also as far as the Green Deal of the European Union is concerned. All this we are looking at, in change in the format of regionalism as it is becoming more and more apparent, The second part, that I'd like to highlight here, once we look at the evolution of trade with politics interacting so at the global platform, is the implications of this as far as trade and investment is concerned. In the first phase, when we had Obama's strategy playing itself out, we really had a sanctity of the multilateral trade rules. Even if RTAs that were deeper than or had provisions that were greater than, deeper than more WTO plus provisions, they were all in accordance with the diktats of the multilateral trade order. While the WTO had slowed down, it was really the regional trading agreements that were taking forward
We've lost.
Yeah,
Can't hear
yeah.
you.
No, no, sir, actually it was our internet. Professor Batra, you
Oh,
go
okay.
on. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just, as I said, I'm just talking about the implications of the manner in which this, geopolitics impact on trade played itself out. In the first phase, we really saw multilateral rules being followed, Although the WTO had slowed down in the sense that the Doha Development Agenda was not going anywhere in terms of finalization of any of the agreements, trade was growing on account of RTAs, the regional trading arrangements, the preferential trading arrangements, or the free trading agreements, whatever may you call them, There was a growth in trade, and the rate of growth in the first period was greater than the rate of GDP. So multiplier effect as far as trade growth was concerned, globalization was concerned, the impact on incomes were concerned, employment, movement of people, everything in terms of a magnified impact as far as globalization was concerned, led, of course, by the parts and components trade, that is the mechanism led by the global value chains, All of this changed to a certain extent, when we've had, when we talk about regionalism as it is emerging today, when we look at the post-Ukraine crisis, regionalism playing itself out, or trade context being impacted by politics today, what we see is a cost in terms of efficiency as far as trade is concerned. That is the earlier tenets of trade, that is trade leading to efficiency, efficient allocation of resources, hence growth as far as incomes are concerned, hence efficient allocation of resources across the world. All of that is changing today. We see a change in the nature of trade. So we are moving away from what is really the real economic terms of trade, the real basis of trade in terms of leading to a more efficient allocation of resources. Today, the manner in which regionalism is being brought about, it is leading to a cost in terms of efficiency. And why is that so? Because trade today is completely dominated by political factors, where you have a restructuring and a reconfiguration of global value chains, which are being based purely on friendly alliances. What we have, what started off in the post-global financial crisis period as offshoring, onshoring, backshoring, or reshoring as far as the host economies were concerned, it is today changing to what we have as friendshoring. The value chains are being reordered and reconfigured purely on the basis of friendly alliances. And the cost here is in terms of efficiency as far as production systems are concerned, So the outcome of this, as we see today, is a slowing down as far as growth of trade is concerned. Trade has definitely slowed down. We are looking at a reconfiguration of the value chains. These value chains that may not necessarily be directed as they were in the earlier period in terms of cost competitiveness, but in terms of what is being termed as resilience, and resilience that is being interpreted in terms of friendshoring and reshoring among countries that are like-minded countries. So there is a very clear demarcation between what was ordering or what was directing value chains and trade in the earlier context, and what is now redirecting trade and value chains in this present context, Although in both contexts and in both periods, over the last 2.5 decades, we are looking at an interaction between politics and economics, What is the impact that we see of all of this, as far as India is concerned, or what are the choices as far as India is concerned? One, of course, we have to realize that even though we're talking about trade or trade context having changed, there is still no doubt about the fact that trade leads to growth, and trade has to be seen as a significant component of the basic equation that we have in terms of consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus X minus M. That is, net exports leading to growth of GDP is something that we must stay by or still live by, So the importance of exports has to be a part of the growth strategy as far as India is concerned. I'm happy to see that this is being realized as far as India is concerned, and we are setting out objectives as far as expansion of exports for ourselves is concerned. The second part is, how do we go about doing this? Are we becoming a part of global value chains? Are we doing value chains on our own completely? I think it's a combination strategy that we are looking at as far as India is concerned, where we are aiming at both participating in global value chains, as we see building complete supply chains within, I have my own, I'm a little skeptical as far as completely building supply chains within the country is concerned. I think I see a more robust mechanism in terms of joining global value chains, because that leads to a greater amount of specialization. I'd also like to see India, liberalize a little more as far as its tariffs are concerned, participate also as far as the IPEF trade pillar is concerned. And in that context, you see, as far as our FTA drive is concerned, I think that's a very, very encouraging step that India is taking as far as its trade policy is concerned, both in terms of what we've done, but also what we are in the process of, UAE, the early harvest scheme as far as Australia is concerned, I think I particularly would commend both our diplomats in terms of the flexibility that has been shown on our part as far as negotiating these two are concerned in a very short time period that we've taken forward both these agreements, particularly the early harvest scheme as far as India-Australia are concerned, given the kind of liberalization of a large number of tariff lines that we've undertaken in that context, 85% plus, you see. I would like to see, of course, a sooner conclusion also of the India-Australia FTA, the Comprehensive Economic Agreement, between the two. As far as UK and EU is concerned, the information, I'm not privy to the negotiations, but the information that one gets from popular press is that the standard chapters, you see, that have been difficult for us at the multilateral level continue to be difficult for us. I think that is where we need to show a greater amount of flexibility as far as our negotiating ability is concerned, in terms of now adapting ourselves to the new tenets as far as negotiation of multilateral trade agreements is concerned, the regional trade agreements is concerned, in terms of an inextricable linkage that has come about in terms of trade and climate change, or trade and labor conditions, you see. I think there is no avoiding these difficult areas of negotiations, and we have to work out a strategy as far as India is concerned towards participating or towards having our own stance, both in terms of a certain domestic policy and in terms of what is required as far as the global standards are concerned in this context. Increasingly, the trade agreements that are being done, you see, both by the United States as well as by the European Union have an active involvement of this, more so as we've seen, and stricter format as far as the European Union is concerned. So I hope we can go through both of these, and this will in fact reflect our own flexibility and our own adaptability to the higher standards as far as trade agreements are concerned. Lastly, I think I would like to add that as far as our, as our FTA strategy is concerned, we should be looking at another set of partners too in Asia, because even if we read the most latest reports and outlook as far as the international agencies are concerned, be that the World Bank or the IMF, it is very clear that the economic dynamism lies in Asia, and there is no denying the fact that India with Southeast Asia, East Asia, these are going to be the lead economies as far as growth in the next few years is concerned, So coming together with these countries, you see, in terms of a trading alliance, whether that be in the form of CPTPP, we look at that, or we look at the larger Indo-Pacific Economic Forum trade pillar, I think is something that we have to decide, but I think we need to decide soon in terms of being able to participate in these platforms, because these are what signify the dynamism as we move forward, both in terms of trade as well as growth. I'll end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Batra. And again, thank you, Professor Chaturvedi, Palit, and Batra, for three excellent, concise, but very detailed presentations touching all aspects of the topic of geopolitics and trade today, and also giving some historical perspective on how things have evolved. So we have about half an hour for questions and answers and also responses from the panelists. So I've got some questions already come in and some further questions on the chat box. What I'll do is I'll try to cluster the questions in kind of related, which sort of form a natural punch. So from one set of questions seems to be linking our domestic industrial policies and competitiveness with our trade strategy. The question from Mohit Jain, an alumnus and CEO of DCW company in Mumbai, he asked the question that his questions are that the production-linked incentives and other government schemes fall far behind the high costs imposed by inputs such as power, interest, and oil, diesel supplied by government. Industry continues to subsidize the government. And then he says also that the signing of FTAs is indiscriminately. He fears is further encouraging countries to export to India rather than make in India. I guess we are getting from Mudit, we are getting a domestic manufacturing entrepreneur's perspective. It's a very important question. And related to this, we have a question from Professor Rajiv Gowda, also Penn alumnus and former professor at IIM Bangalore and former Rajya Sabha MP. Why is India not benefiting enough from Western companies' China plus one diversification? We all know that a lot of this is going to Vietnam, Indonesia, and other places. Not much of it is being come to India so far. So that's his question. And let me just take these two. And Dr. Marshall Bouton, Center for the Advanced Study of India, University of Pennsylvania, how can India increase its exports in order to increase its GDP faster? In the current context, when exports have been not exactly doing too well. At least exports of goods, services have been doing well, as we have seen in the past year. So I've clustered these three questions, and let's get some responses, then I'll go to the other questions, since these seem to form a natural cluster. So let me start with Professor Chaturvedi.
Thank you, Sri. Thanks a lot. I think 2 points I would like to make. One is in terms of the exports and what is it that we can do, and I think it's an issue we have been dealing with for some time. The figures, the impact of exchange rate, etc. It's very much there on the table, but much more important is to realize that the direction has to be reconsidered. The focus on the markets which are getting into the grip of recession should not be the sole focus. We need to expand. Efforts have been made by Commerce Ministry in the past. Those efforts are continuing for identifying the Latin American countries, the African countries, our agreements with them. And there, Shri, I feel trade alone should not be looked into. And this is my response to the other question that you had on China Plus. The fact that is now evolving is a new context of investment, and hitherto investment provisions have been part of a small section in FTAs. The thing that is required to be reversed is to have investment as an engine, which is also AFCFTA's call for investing in Africa and becoming part of the trade opportunities that offers. Same is the effort that ACLAC is trying to bring in. So here, investments are going to dominate. They are going to provide a fillip that is needed by the trade. So this, I think, is something that is of great significance. Investment as an opportunity for our enterprises to expand, connect, and expand the trade. That's one. The second point that I want to make is in terms of Make in India and PLI. Yes, the PLI is evolved at a time when the global geopolitical situation, the global supply chains, the scope to have parts and components embedded in the kind of value chains that we are looking into, both from the production perspective and also from the trade perspective. Both, I think, are important. And that's where the point that Amitendra was making, I think, was a brilliant point in terms of identifying the distinction that is there between Australia and others and India, where domestic market considerations are huge. And this is what is going to bring in the new market that we are trying to create. So Make in India is not a empty vessel. It is very much having the substantive provisions for having gain in terms of I would say import substitution, which some people have been describing it as, but it certainly enables the ability to bring in adequate competition with support of whatever industrial policy disconnect we have seen in the previous 3 decades. So this effort of combining the two, which Amitendra beautifully articulated, I think is going to be important. Thank you, Shri.
Thank you. Amitendra?
Shri, I think I will reflect on 2 points on the back of what Sachin just mentioned. And the first of it is the question of the PLIs. See, I think PLIs are a way of financially incentivizing investments into sectors where local production is essential for increasing domestic capacities, and again, largely with the objective of reducing overdependence. Now, let's look at this thing subjectively. This is something which is not a realization that has come over time. Across the world, when we look at studies, and the WTO's work itself in this regard is very essential, which shows that nearly 20% of global exports are those kind of exports which have very large market shares globally, but are very crucially dependent on 1 or 2 limited locations for their sourcing. Now, Sri, the point is that how did this pattern emerge? See, this was not by accident. This was economic efficiency that led to the emergence of this pattern, where the businesses deliberately chose concentration for the very simple reason that concentration provided them economic benefits. Sourcing heavily from a country like China, or say, for example, from certain countries of Southeast Asia, actually gave them that economic benefit as opposed to wide-scale diversification, which would have compromised on economic efficiency. Now, today, when one looks at this entire landscape, what businesses today encounter are the questions of price, delivery, quality as they used to earlier. But in addition to that, they also encounter geopolitics. And for that, this is a realization that has also dawned upon the governments that obviously there has to be some sort of a state-based commitment into cutting out this broad policy of concentration and encourage diversification. But when you look at this from an Indian perspective, the fact remains that the PLIs are instruments merely for achieving certain ends, but those ends are not going to immediately materialize because the economic conditions continue to remain significantly strong on the other end of the spectrum. Let's say, for example, you alluded to Vietnam. Vietnam has received some investments which have moved out of China. But the point is, these investments did not come after COVID. These investments came well before COVID when the US-China tariff war began. And at that point in time, it was much more sensible to get located in Vietnam and export from Vietnam back to the United States for avoiding tariffs that would have arisen on exports from China to the United States. Vietnam as a country also suffers from compression of scale as opposed to a country like China, as opposed to a country like Japan. So I think the point to be noted here is that the PLIs are not going to be overnight successful. Perhaps they will be selectively successful, as we have seen in the case of smartphones, but they're not going to be immediately successful in certain areas, maybe say solar panel modules or chemicals and so on and so forth, where the business efficiency ecosystem will take time to develop. And when one looks at this larger question that there's a question that you shared on FTAs and the kind of partners they are being entered into, whether they're being discriminate or indiscriminate. Look, I think, how does one choose FTA partners? Ideally, under a multilateral rules-based trade regime, everybody is a partner. Now, within that multilateral rules-based trade regime, if you are going for a subset, a bilateral arrangement or a regional arrangement, there are certain logics that follow it. Earlier, there used to be a question of geographic contiguity. Now, I suppose those questions have been replaced by more challenging and more evolving options, including politics. Now, when I look at the current FTA engagements that India has gone into, clearly there has been a combination of various factors which have been taken into account. It is not always possible to comprehend whether these are the right decisions necessarily, because let's say, for example, if India is looking at negotiating a free trade agreement with Israel, for example, or the Gulf cooperation countries, it's obviously clear that there's not just economics behind it. There's also politics behind it. But, those are instances that have happened in the past as well. If you look back at the United States' history of signing free trade agreements, all the US FTAs are with those countries which happen to be defense partners of the United States. So I think this is a question which needs to be decided subjectively. Obviously, FTAs are two-way traffics. If India wants to engage into an FTA with the European Union, it is going to be a considerable two-way traffic where there are going to be important concessions involved on both sides. And it's not just a question, as we sometimes have felt, that because India is a very large market, everybody would be interested in coming and getting negotiated with India. That it doesn't happen that way. So I think when we look at FTAs and the partners, we need to be very careful about the fact that the strategic landscape of the world is changing fundamentally, and it's not going to remain static. There's a very dynamic change that is coming up in this regard, and that understanding must be reflected in the flexibility that India employs in choosing its FTA partners.
Thank you. Professor Amitabh Batra?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'd like to give my points or my opinion on these 3 points. Starting with the last, which is on choice of partners as far as FTAs is concerned, I would slightly differ from what Amitendu just said, in the sense that as far as choice of FTA partners is concerned, it's not a subjective issue, it's a very objective element, Assuming that underlying all FTAs, or underlying all trade instruments, as I said, political leanings have always been a part of it. You cannot be an FTA, you cannot be doing an FTA with an enemy country, that's a given, So among those, where you have these like-minded nations, what is it that decides or determines who you who you draw an agreement with, In terms of deriving benefits, which are economic benefits, there are 2 points, that you should be looking at. One is, of course, geographical proximity. But this geographical proximity need not be with, in the sense, if you're contiguous with a country, such as India is with many South Asian countries, doesn't mean that you only indulge in FTAs with a contiguous country. But you have to have geographic proximity combined with a country or a set of countries that also constitute what we call as a GVC hub, global value chain hub, because that is what will allow your companies to be able to benefit from the kind of fragmentation that production or large multinational corporations have allowed for, and then allow your companies to be able to specialize in parts and components, what we also call as tasks, and be able to benefit the country through backward linkages. Over time, probably also being able to develop certain forward linkages, through technological diffusion. This is how it has worked as a process as far as many Southeast Asian countries are concerned. And as a part of this, or somewhere along the process, there has also been a very significant role in these countries in terms of bringing down their tariffs, whether it was through a market-led process or whether it was through the common effective preferential tariff of the ASEAN. That's one. You see, you have to combine all these factors to be able to take advantage of the FTA. Lowering your own tariffs is a prior to taking advantage of a tariff of an FTA. Otherwise, a deficit with the partner country is inevitable because their tariffs are already lower. This is simple economics. When we talk about Vietnam, again, it's the same. Vietnam entered the WTO only in 2007. But look at it in the last 15 years, how many FTAs has it done? It has used these FTAs to undertake domestic reforms, both in its tariffs, trade policy, as well as in its investment policy. Compare it with your own investment policy and the bilateral investment treaty model that we have today of the 2016, you see. There is a huge amount of difference. They've carried out reforms even as far as their labor market is concerned, their land market is concerned. So domestic reforms have been undertaken per force because of their participation in these FTAs, which have been the most advanced FTAs with the most advanced countries, forcing them to undertake these domestic policy changes, you see. As far as India is concerned, we did start with some of the most significant FTAs in the early 2000s, such as the ASEAN, But I think somewhere along the line, the way we negotiated it was not such as to give us an advantage in the goods segment. What we hoped in the services segment also did not come through. We need to revise that, but that review should be undertaken quickly enough. We could have participated in the RCEP. We haven't done that, but there is still an opportunity as far as the CPTPP is concerned, provided we are willing to make the necessary domestic policy changes. Lastly, as far as China +1 is concerned, I would say the same. In terms of what has been mentioned earlier, as far as domestic market is concerned, scale is concerned, PLI is concerned. See, we must understand, you see, that as far as attracting investment from abroad is concerned, what kind of investment do we want to attract? We want to attract the investment that brings the first best technology and not the second best technology. If you bring an investment that will satisfy only the domestic market, then you will never get the first best technology. You have to bring in the investment that will be attracted to your country as a base for production of exports. So until and unless we reorient the production-linked incentive scheme to beyond just the domestic market, until and unless we learn to interpret or we understand Atmanirbharta, not just in terms of building supply chains for our own country, but building supply chains such that we are able to satisfy demand within as well as in the global context. I think we will not be able to achieve the manufacturing competitiveness that's absolutely essential to be able to push exports that we are hoping for to contribute to our growth process. This is a linkage that other countries have already developed in the last 2.5 decades, or certainly in the last decade, countries like Vietnam, by participating in multiple FTAs as well as mega regional trade agreements. We haven't done it so far. The context has changed today, but not so much. If you still look at Southeast Asia, East Asia, if you look at the RCEP, if you look at the CPTPP, if you look at Southeast Asia, it is one of the regions that has not adopted the same protectionist instruments and trade policies as are being adopted by the developed world, be it the IRA as far as North America is concerned, or the CBAM or Green Deal as far as the EU is concerned. Therefore, a relook to Southeast Asia, East Asia, I think is imperative when we are looking at the choice of partners, even today for India. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we have just about 12 minutes left. So I'm just trying to cluster and put some topping on the remaining questions and to leave enough time for each of you to make brief responses. Given that, I mean, like CP, TPP and so on, and IPEF, all these will involve new sort of climate change, sustainable development kind of, criteria. I mean, Professor Balveer Arora, formerly rector of JNU and with now Center for Multi-Level Federalism, his question is that, do we need a global financial arrangement for funding expenditure to meet sustainable development goals in countries of the global south? And I would add to that, look, how will India cope with these criteria being part of new trade deals, which they will increasingly become? Then the other few questions are from Jisha Jain, Sumit Gupta, and Paresh Patel, who are more directly geopolitical questions like, will India join NATO plus? I mean, NATO plus is just at the moment not anything on the ground, but should India get aligned? Basically, is Jisha Jain's question: are we leaving non-aligned movement behind? And Sumit Gupta's question is, what is the future geopolitical roadmap for India? Now, let me just try to pull these together and say that, look, on Russia-Ukraine, we've been trying to walk a middle path, given our dependence on Russian arms supplies, arms components, and on China too in the Quad. I mean, the Quad has remained basically a consultative mechanism, not a military mechanism, unlike AUKUS, which has been formed by existing allies. India is still not, prepared to, it is still, even post-Galwan, there's been jump in India-China trade. India seems to be trying to play some kind of middle path. Now, the larger question is, should we align, clearly with the US and the West, or is this middle path something which gives us negotiating power in the emerging global trade scenario? Let me try to sum it up like that. So, we have about 10 minutes, so brief responses to this, please. Dr. Chaturvedi.
I would just like to say, Shri, more in terms of what Professor Arora asked, in terms of the need to have a global financial deal. And I think, as I said earlier, we used to think trade as an engine of economic growth, and then we realized how technology is interwoven in that strategy, and later on with investment. But I think now Professor Arora is right. Finance plays an extremely important role, not only for absorbing the fluctuations that we are seeing, but also, as WTO report has shown clearly, several of the Global South member countries require support for financing trade. And that, I think, is becoming a major challenge in terms of how finances are arranged. And as I was saying, investment and investment-led trade deals are assuming far greater significance for the Global South. The continuous contraction of the G7, the ability to have per unit greater returns on exports to G7 is also declining. Some work is being done by us in terms of how that gap has reduced. So the amount of profit and the remit that you used to get after exporting to West now is declining. So those profit margins are getting squeezed, and greater efforts for financialization would be important. NATO plus and others, I think, are more strategic issues. They are completely out of trade domain because they are not reinforcing the way we saw trade, investment, technology, and finance, all the four sectors are getting hooked up with the value chains that we have been discussing in this seminar. Thank you, Shri.
Thank you. Dr. Palit?
Shri, look, I think I'll just try to come back to the main theme on which we began this conversation, the connection between trade and investment in geopolitics. I think it's extremely important that this subject, not just from the perspective of India, but from the rest of the world, should be approached in a way which tries to combine the salience of both subjects. It's very difficult to reach conclusions on the basis of regional experiences because regional experiences are fractured. When, let us say, for example, we look at Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia as a region has really shied away from taking very strong decisions as far as trade is concerned because of the reasons of pragmatism. When we look at an agreement like the RCEP compared with the CPTPP, the RCEP is an extremely low ambition agreement. Compared with the CPTPP has only 4 Southeast Asian countries in those. So I don't think it's fair to jump to regional experiences or drawing conclusions on why countries should choose other countries as partners, particularly when there are examples of countries getting into trade relations with those countries who between themselves have very cold political relations. The China-Taiwan Economic Cooperation and Financial Agreement is the best example. So the bigger point over here is that when geopolitics becomes an issue, then there is obviously a need, and perhaps that need is not an optimal need. Perhaps that's not the right need, but there is a need, a pressing need to take economic decisions on the basis of what might be the best in geopolitical interests. There can be a debate on whether that's the right way forward. But the fact of the matter is that across the world, geopolitics will continue to inflict a large number of influence on several decisions that countries take. And today, there is every reason to believe that countries that have the ability to quote unquote weaponize their positions in global trade will actually keep doing so. The European Union will perhaps try to do this in the area of environment. There are other countries which are resource exporting countries might try to do it in their own regard. So in that sense, in that context, it's hardly any straightforward logic of economic benefit and consistency that is going to make at least a country like India choose its partners in an effective fashion. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Batra.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll go back to the question that you had asked, in terms of what should be, whether India should continue to follow the middle path, I don't want to say the middle path. I think I want to place two main, very concrete suggestions, or concrete points, as far as India's policy is concerned. I think India today is unlike what it was earlier, and the foreign policy that we see as far as India is concerned today is not passive, reactive, it is active. We are taking our independent stance, and we are shaping this independent stance completely, in alignment with what we think is our national interest, irrespective of whether it aligns with what at any one point of time be EU's interest or North America's interest, West or East, So that's one. I think that's the kind of delicate flexibility that India has been able to adopt and put forth as its main contour, of shaping its foreign policy. I think that's what India should stick with. Look at its own interest and do that in terms of shaping its stance in any context, whether that be in terms of trade, investment, trade agreements, or otherwise, I think that's very important. You find your allies as it suits you. And I say this in particular, because I want to highlight this fact, that look at the United States or look at the EU, Both these that were talking about decoupling only a few months ago, today are talking about de-risking, are talking about risk management, I mean, how quickly have they changed their positions, realizing, that complete breakaway from, what is that monopolized market today, as far as whether it be technology, supply chains, networks, it's going to be a very difficult task to completely decouple from that one center point, call it what you may, So similarly, I think India has also to be judicious in its foreign policy choices, maintaining flexibility and choosing where it sees economic dynamism for itself as the means for growth and growth in exports in particular. I think I'll end.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I thank all our three speakers for excellent and concise, detailed presentations and for responses to the questions. I've had to cluster the questions in a sort of in related bunches so that, because of the time constraint, we've just got about a couple of minutes left. I'll just do a 2-minute sort of final comment. That is, if you look at, in the context of the discussion we've had in the last hour and a half, at international relations theory, the debate between the neo-realists and the neo-liberals, who seems to be right? On the one hand, the neo-realists say, look, international order can break down anytime. What you need is military power. Military power will continue to define the global power structure. And they point to how an old-style war, like a full-scale land invasion, Russia into Ukraine, is happening. And the neoliberals say, look, this actually shows that the power of economic interdependence and what 4 decades ago, Kyohen and I call complex interdependence, which has become several degrees more complex, is going to mitigate wars, at least among all major countries, major economies. I mean, you might have wars in, say, places which are marginal to the world economy, Afghanistan, Syria, and so on. You might have the most border clashes between major countries which are manageable, like India, China. But you're not going to have wholesale wars happening in any of the major sort of interdependent countries. So the level of polarization is mitigated, according to the neoliberals, by the level of and continuing interdependence, and with everybody depending upon the global ecology surviving. I mean, we are going to be even more interdependent. So in that sense, the political polarization is going to be mitigated. And the neoliberals argue that military power is going to be less and less usable, less and less leverageable. And therefore, the power will increasingly be defined by economic power and ingredients of economic power, including science and technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, education, all of that. And if the world moves towards a power structure where economic power is increasingly defining what defines the power structure, India, in its ongoing rise, will be relatively advantaged, because India is not, for various reasons, going to be a major military power despite possessing nuclear weapons, because it has two nuclear weapon powers along its entire northern and western border. It is blocked. It's what I've called earlier in my writings a blocked power, militarily speaking. In southwards, there's just empty space of the Indian Ocean. So it's not able to project power. It is basically a deterrent power, a defensive power. So it cannot make any of the major weapon systems. It's going in a services direction, not in a manufacturing direction so far. So if the world moves towards what the neoliberals argue is going to be a world which is defined increasingly by economic power, that will actually be advantageous to India's ongoing rise. That's my broad point. And in this interaction between geopolitics and trade, as India's weight in India's weight in world trade is still quite low. If we do some smart negotiating, if these ongoing trade agreements are being negotiated in the geopolitical context, and along with the PLIs and domestic pushing domestic competitiveness, if this whole story works out successful, then we are going to go somewhere. But there are a lot of snags on the way, so we have to be very vigilant about the kind of policies that we are following. We should not fall back into import substitution, protectionism, that will get us nowhere, and we should not get into confrontations which we might lose. So there is a need to maintain a sort of nimble flexibility, is what I see. So, I mean, in that last comment, I'd like to once again thank our three speakers and thank all of you in the audience for making time to attend this. Thank you all so very much, and have a great evening or a great day if you are in if it's your morning. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye,
Thank you.
Amita. Bye,
Thank you.
Sachin.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.